CRASH stands for the Conference on Research in the Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities. We like to remind all of our STEM brethren and that as much as we love them, we believe that it's always good to spotlight all of the great work at UC San Diego that goes with the social sciences, the arts, the humanities, and we have a great return roster for this afternoon. Really, it's great to have the program revived. I don't think we have done it in more than a year and a half. So with good luck and with participation from people like these presenters, we'll be able to have a CRASH event every quarter. And really, the nice thing would be to have a mix of virtual and eventually some in-person events. So to our presenters, I'm especially grateful that you are bringing CRASH back. To our audience, I'm really happy that you're taking some time of some of your afternoon to spend with us and listen to these great presentations. Today we have a pretty broad range of topics, but they're all united by some sort of mixture of language and representation and power. And I think that just looking at the titles, I'm really excited to see what happens when we talk about the way that people, characters, but also activists can present themselves to erase that distance between the stage or the street or the runway and make sure that there's room in all of those areas, all of those presentation environments for a different kind of language, for different access to power. So I'm really excited to hear these talks. And I believe we should get started. I just want Marie to tell me if the order I'm looking at is the order of presentation. So
yes, the order is the order.
Okay, so then everyone please join me in welcoming Erin Baseman, whose presentation is titled A 21st Century Peter Pan, How Girlhood and Femininity in Children's Literature Has Changed a Century Later. Erin, thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Erin. I'm a senior here at UCSD, and I am in 6th College. I'm a literature writing major. And yeah, I'm super excited to share my research with you guys. Am I okay to share my screen?
Yes, you can.
Perfect. Okay, I have some slides. Okay, perfect. Oh. Okay, perfect. So yes, my research is about the representation of girlhood and femininity in children's literature. And in my research, I really looked at 2 novels. So I looked at Peter Pan, written by J.M. Barrie in 1911, so close to the turn of the 20th century. And I looked at Ruby the Red Fairy by Daisy Meadows, which came out in 2005. Super quick synopsis of each book. Peter Pan, if you don't know it, it is about a young boy who lives in Neverland, so he never grows up. He lives with all of his friends, the Lost Boys, and they just are children forever. They play imagination and they fight pirates and just generally get into ruckus like that. And then Ruby the Red Fairy is about 2 girls, Rachel and Kirsty, who meet on vacation, stumble upon Ruby the Fairy, and agree to help her find all of her other rainbow coordinated sisters as they got cast out of fairyland. So something that's really important to understand going into this is the idea of the romantic child. And the romantic child was a common literary trope in the Victorian and Edwardian era, and Peter Pan super embodies this trope. The romantic child was really less about appealing to children and more about appealing to adults by romanticizing childhood through children characters. So some common attributes to this character would be someone close to nature and very separate from the adult world. And we totally see this with Peter Pan's character. He refuses to grow up. He's super intertwined with nature. He like wears leaves. His lost boy wears the skin of animals. They like live under a mushroom. But most importantly, it's this childlike sense that keeps him separate from the adult world, particularly with how he is unaware of how his actions have consequences. And these consequences have the greatest effect on the women that he brings into his life, particularly Tinkerbell and Wendy. So Tinkerbell is very much a part of his little group. She is also a fairy. And he doesn't necessarily like need permission, of course, to be friends with other people, but there is a very much a lack of understanding that bringing in someone else could change a dynamic. And so Tinkerbell becomes very jealous because she is in love with Peter. She wears green, like she is meant to be envious. And so she hates Wendy. And there is just no other choice. She must hate Wendy, to the point where even when Peter is bringing Wendy and the Lost Boys into Neverland, Tinkerbell tells the Lost Boys, like, Peter wants you to shoot down the Wendy bird. Just get rid of her. I don't want her. And so that very much begins this idea of like what the role of women is in this society. They are meant to serve, because Wendy is being brought to Neverland to be a mother, and strictly to be a mother at like 12 or 13 to Peter and the Lost Boys. And that is it. And then we see with Tinkerbell, like, that's not okay with her because she wants to be in that role, if that makes sense. And then we can compare this to Ruby the Red Fairy. And Ruby the Red Fairy very much, it comes from the idea of the romantic child, but is not one, which is what heralds her into the 21st century. So like Peter Pan, her life is very much rooted in nature. She is the red fairy. She is responsible for giving the color red to everything that is red in the natural world. I've included some illustrations from the chapter book. You can see they have little frog attendants. They live in little toadstool houses. Their land is described as having bright green rolling hills and bright blue rivers. And so nature is very much an important part of her life. And then like a child, she's very physically small. Like she is a little fairy. And so in that way, she represents being a child. But where she differs from the romantic child is that she is not kind of helpless in the way that we see in Peter Pan. She gets into trouble and she figures out how to get out of it. She knows the importance of friendship, and she is not deterred by any outside forces, and she's very self-motivated from within. And so with that, I have termed her the dynamic girl. And the dynamic girl, I think, is something we see in a lot of children's chapter book literature of this time. I think we can see it in Junie B. Jones. I think we can see it in Miss Frizzle from the Magic School Bus. I think we can see it in Fancy Nancy, if you're familiar with any of those books. But it is very much this idea that just because she is a girl doesn't mean she can't be loud. She asks for help. She reaches out for help. All of that kind of stuff. And we don't see that in any of the female characters in Peter Pan. Like I mentioned before, Wendy's purpose is to come to Neverland and to be Peter and the Lost Boys' mother. He's like, come read stories to us and tuck us in at night and mend our clothes. And she's at 12 years old, like, great, that sounds like my dream life. Let's go do it. And by doing so, she provides Peter with way less responsibility. Peter just starts leaving and just never coming back. And so it very much represents this idea that, oh, it is a girl's dream to be a mother. And that is like what they all want to do. And that is very much what we see, particularly in the Edwardian time. Because like I said, Wendy is about 12 or 13, and she's just like, this is amazing. I love this. But it's really not representative of like the girlhood experience. But what is girlhood? So according to the Oxford Dictionary, girlhood is just like the state of being a girl. I feel like in this context, it's a little more specific to being a girl in your childhood before adolescence. And so I asked a bunch of women in my life, different ages, different backgrounds, like what what was girlhood to you? And these were all the responses that I got back. It was a time of adventure and silliness and playfulness and, love and grace with each other and imagination and freedom, which is just not what is seen with Wendy's or Tinkerbell's character in Peter Pan. And so that's why that's what makes Ruby's character so significant, because even just less than 100 years later, she brings this idea of the romantic child, kind of an evolved version of it, into the 21st century as a way to kind of reflect this movement of what women are supposed to be in society, particularly with how it's portrayed to children. And in that, there's the idea of femininity. And in Ruby the Red Fairy, gender is very much represented as equal. We see, and it's represented in different powers of fairies that are seen. Like there's the evil character, Jack Frost, and the Queen of the Fairies, Queen Titiana, and their power is not greater than one another, is very much equal. They can't override one or the other, and they also can't completely stop the other. And so it's very almost compatible in a way, and it's showing that there's no greater version of the other, but there's also no shame in being feminine. Ruby is a very, in my opinion, like classically girly character. She wears dresses and has roses in her hair, but she is also not afraid to be loud and to get help when she needs it and to take charge of her own life. Whereas in Peter Pan, femininity is very much only for women. We see it in Mr. Darling, Wendy's dad. There are moments where he just like feels he is emasculated for kind of silly reasons, which really just reveals like the fragility of gender norms in Edwardian society, and again with like Tinkerbell's character and how she, is basically slotted for one thing, and that one thing is to be jealous and or to care for Peter Pan. And as soon as another woman comes in, she just kind of loses it. And so those differences in Ruby the Red Fairy are kind of what brings this Peter Pan-like character into the 21st century and representing where women are at and their role in society, in culture, and literature, where it's at today and what we expect of children and girls. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. That was really fascinating. I think what we can do is maybe take a couple of questions if people have them, and then maybe we'll come back and have a kind of a group discussion at the end. But I just want to make sure if people have questions now that we don't forget them by the time we get to the end. So are there any questions for Erin? I have a couple. I have one sort of general, and I find this really, as I said, really fascinating. So when you look at that picture of what you call the period of the romanticized childhood, it seems really almost surprising to me that this is in the same period when there's really harsh child labor going on. And I think that, the presentation in a novel like Peter Pan and some of the other books is a way for the adult society to distance itself from what actual childhood was like if you weren't in a certain class. This is when you had 10 and 12-year-olds, people Peter and Wendy's age, who were working in factories and doing things like that. Did you come upon any commentary about the romanticized childhood versus the kind of actual childhood?
That's a really good question. I didn't stumble upon any kind of like other research about that, but I think it's important to note that this literary trope like evolved. So it began in the Victorian era, which happened before like the Industrial Revolution. Of course, times like weren't generally great, but so I think it probably started as that, maybe going into the Industrial Revolution, and adults then kind of being like, oh, like remember when like life used to be so much better, like especially as a kid, or my life is better as a kid than it is now because now I got to go work in a factory. And I think from there, that's where the trope began to develop. into the Edwardian era. And then I think things probably changed with World War One. But I think that's probably where the trope came from. So even if we're looking at the Edwardian era, it's not so much those adults creating that trope, but more of just developing the groundwork that was already laid.
Great, thank you. There's a question in the chat, which is, how did you select these two books for your comparison?
Oh, I love this question. Ruby the Red Fairy was the book that made me just love reading when I was a kid. I just loved the characters. I felt like I related to the main characters, and it's just the book that made me love reading. And then I thought the similarities between Peter Pan and Ruby the Red Fairy were so similar, but also so different, that I really wanted to compare the two and how they represented girlhood and femininity. Because Peter Pan isn't technically like a children's book, but it's often regarded as one, which is a whole other conversation. So I just thought that was really interesting. I just wanted to compare the two and how we look at, femininity and gender.
Great, thank you. Let's move on. As I said, maybe we'll have a chance to come back and have a kind of a group discussion, but that was a very nice, very thought-provoking presentation, Erin. Thank you very much. So our next presenter is Jasmine Robinson, and her presentation is titled "The Representation of Black Women Fashion Designers in the Music Industry." Jasmine, please take the floor.
Hi, everyone. So nice to meet everyone. Apologies in advance. I'm very sick, so my voice is a little bit gone. So just bear with me as I try to speak normally. But yeah, so excited to share my research today. Can everyone see my screen okay? Awesome, perfect. Okay, so today I'm going to be presenting my research on Black women fashion designers in the music industry. I conducted this project in the COM 138 class with Professor Boatema Boateng, so shout out to her. So I'll start off by giving a little bit of a background into the underrepresentation of Black female fashion designers in the fashion industry. One of the biggest metrics of success in the fashion industry is New York Fashion Week. It goes over the biggest trends from the year, and Black female fashion designers are severely underrepresented. As you can see here, out of the total 260 shows at New York Fashion Week in 2015, there were only 7 Black fashion designers represented, which is absolutely astronomical to me. While Black designers are determined to gain equal footings in the door in the industry, they often lack the networks to gain a stable footing. Positions of power in the industry are often held primarily by white designers, and a lack of representation in this fashion industry reflects in ways like Runway, magazines, kind of everywhere throughout the industry. Previous research has identified many common reasons for this underrepresentation. While there's no conclusive framework for it, these are some common examples. One being lack of art education in public schools, another one being lack of networking opportunities, and another one being systemic racism and unconscious bias. So there's a lot of data surrounding the variety of methods for Black women fashion designers to find success within the white-dominated fashion industry, but the research I found left out the crucial role of the music industry in providing a platform for these designers to be seen. So this was my overarching thesis throughout the project, which was that while Black women fashion designers are often overlooked in the fashion industry, Black female musicians leverage the music industry as a space to recognize the contributions of these fashion designers. And throughout my research, I also went through a couple of theoretical frameworks from the course that I was taking to kind of structure my analysis. So one of those was to look at controlling images, which is a term coined by Patricia Hill Collins. And these are stereotypical representations that work to support systems of oppression. I also looked at the term intersectionality, which is coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it's a theoretical framework that describes the way social identities like gender and race interact to create systems of discrimination and social inequalities. And I also looked at sexual scripts, which is a term coined by Aisha Durham, which explores the controlling images of Black women in pop music specifically through sexual scripts, which are cultural messages which teach us how to perform sexuality, experience our sexual selves, and engage with others. And so exactly why are Black female fashion designers so important to the music industry? Black womanhood has previously been portrayed through narrow representations and controlling images. Many musical artists have had to identify with these narratives to gain a footing in their initial careers in the music industry. For example, Beyonce has portrayed sexually expressive, controlling images of Black womanhood, while also the respectable and non-threatening Black woman. By utilizing these controlling images to identify with both provocative hip hop culture and also maintaining her respectability, Beyonce was thus able to gain wide success in the music industry to where she is today. And now, as Black female artists can have gained more power and voice in the music industry, they've focused on presenting new positive images of Black womanhood, specifically through their stylistic choices. So by collaborating with Black female fashion designers who are also focused on changing these narratives, Black musical artists are rewriting history to present new perceptions of Black womanhood in both the fashion and music industries. So this was my methodology throughout the project. I conducted a content analysis of celebrity news, music videos, and films where additional information came from fashion industry sources. So one of the biggest examples that I could find here was Beyonce. We all know and love her. Her leadership in providing opportunities for creatives of color has given a spotlight to many Black female fashion designers whose work continues to expand the ideal beauty images expected of Black women. One specific project that Beyonce did was called Black is King, which was a visual album and documentary, which spotlighted many Black women fashion designers to represent the African diaspora's identity. One example of these designers is Loza Maleombo, whose website immediately crashed and the demand for orders reached an all-time high after the release of the film Black is King. Her sales rose by 300% after the release, which was absolutely crazy, and they like to call it the Beyonce effect. In addition, we also have the artist Lizzo, who focuses on challenging the narratives related to big girls in the music industry. She's got a reality show called Watch Out for the Big Girls, which spotlights Black-owned fashion brand Vichy. The brand founder and fashion designer Tony Grant has since continued to gain critical recognition from New York Fashion Week and Essence. And this show just spotlighted and gave voice to a ton of other fashion designers that are also really cool. And a final example is the artist Saweetie, who partners directly with her stylist Sankara to give underground Black designers a platform. One specific one is named Kala Whitney, who's a fashion designer, and her works have been seen on artists like Cardi B and Saweetie during Fashion Week. And one quote that I really liked was that Saweetie, by sharing their work with her 3.5 million Instagram followers, gives them instant recognition, reaping more benefits than waiting for a small cosign in a magazine. And an additional finding that I had was that, in addition, established Black musical artists are also becoming fashion designers themselves through relation to popular brands, kind of establishing themselves in the fashion industry in a unique way. So by utilizing branding and relatable themes, these artists establish themselves as household names within the music and fashion industries. Some examples being Lizzo's Yitty, Alicia Keys' collaboration with Athleta, and Rihanna's brand Savage X Fenty. So thank you to my class for letting me do this awesome research. That is my work, and thank you guys.
Thank you, Jasmine. That was really terrific. Questions for Jasmine? You can shout out or raise your hand. Anyone? So let me ask you, Jasmine, about somebody I think of as kind of a pioneer in this space too, to Missy Elliott, and how she kind of made fashion something that was serving her. Like she wasn't doing, it seems, tell me if I'm reading this incorrectly, but she was doing Missy, right? She wasn't trying to gain some sort of approval, and she found a way to like bypass these narrow critical judgments. Is that something that you've seen with the people you chose as examples here? I mean, it seems like they found a way of speaking directly to a particular audience. So maybe they're better served by not being in the traditional industry focus. Is that something that you noticed?
Yeah, I think it's been a really interesting thing to look at people who are specifically in the pop territory versus kind of expanding that. Missy is one I would have loved to research further, because I think she's got such an interesting way of using style as a narrative and letting that kind of showcase her own beliefs and values and things like that. So I wish I got to kind of pay more attention to her. But it was kind of hard to find research to back up many of the different fashion designers that have been used in relation to music. Beyonce was kind of the only one that I found hardcore evidence on early on. And I did a lot of research on Janet Jackson as well. So it was kind of an interesting way of finding the information, but Missy's one I would love to look at further.
Great, thank you. Any other comments or questions for Jasmine? If not, thank you again, really just terrific. So we'll go to our next presenter, and I'm going to pronounce this last name as well as I can, but please forgive me if it's not. Fatima Messiel, feel free to correct me. And her presentation is titled Voting Rights and Federalism, Understanding the California Voting Rights Act. Fatima, please.
Hi, thank you, David, for the introduction. But yes, let me go ahead and share my screen with y'all. Okay. Let me know if everyone can see it. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay. So like David said, my presentation is, oh, it skipped forward. My presentation is on voting rights, specifically federalism, understanding the California Voting Rights Act. So I actually did this research with the University of Notre Dame over the summer, and I got to work closely with my professor, Luis Braga. So let me continue. Okay. So the motivations for this research, as we all know, the Latino and minority populations in California continue to grow, but the representation in elected government positions fail to reflect this growth. So this disconnect between the two actually signifies an urgency and importance of having conversations regarding the apportionment and equal representation among our communities. Since the passing of the California Voting Rights Act in 2002, over 88 cities and 165 school districts across the state have been mandated under the law to change their at-large elections to single-member district elections. The primary objective of this project is to uncover and fill in the gaps in the knowledge regarding the relationship between the switch from at-large elections to district elections and their effect on minority voters and representation. So one of the questions that we really tried to tackle was, while the CVRA was created with the intent of extending non-white minorities protections from voter dilution, while simultaneously increase their voter turnout and participation, were those representational gains actually evident in the communities it was meant to impact? So our hypothesis was that our research demonstrates that the CVRA has been effective in increasing representation. Sorry, my computer's lagging a little bit, so it's going through my slides funny. But so to move on to our frameworks and methods, the main theory that we use was federalism. A little recap of federalism, if you're not super sure, it's the way how our government system divides powers between both the state and national government. So states typically have power over marriage laws, education laws, and how they tax their individuals. And then the federal obviously has their own powers as well. Two questions that we try to look at using this theory was, how can we further the evolution of the voter protection rights, both at the state and federal level? And then what happens when the state takes back its power to provide minorities rights when historically the opposite has been more common in policy? In addition to the theory, we used two specific methods, looking at quasi-experimental methods. So we looked at both city and district cases and analyzed the voter representation rates 5 years before and then 5 years after the switch from at-large elections to district elections. And then in addition to that, we compiled an up-to-date case of all the court cases and litigation threats that have been filed under violation of the CVRA since its passing in 2002. So some key differences that we want to note between the Federal Voting Rights Act and the California Voting Rights Act was, starting primarily with the Voting Rights Act, it was initially aimed to overcome discriminatory voter suppression practices specifically against African Americans. So if we take a look at Section 2, it writes that you cannot discriminate individuals on the basis of race, color, or language minority status. So that could be used through either literacy tests or poll taxes, any sort of those things they were not allowed. And then Section 4 and 5, which don't actually exist anymore, but I still want to cover them. Section 4B was a coverage formula that determined the jurisdictions that people were subject to, or that states were subject to in Section 5. And I know that sounds a little bit confusing, so let me just go back a few steps and explain exactly what that means. So historically, as we all know, there were certain states in the US that discriminated against individuals and tried to suppress their votes in elections, and the federal government was very much aware of that. So they established Section 4 as this coverage formula to essentially determine which of those states fell into this Section 5 pre-clearance. So they would, I don't know exactly what the coverage formula consisted of, but it existed. And based on that, you would see certain states would come up. And then if you fell into that formula and you came out that you needed to have a pre-clearance, Section 5 came into play and essentially said that if you wanted to change your voting rights or how you conducted your voting or what voting rights you were extending, that you had to get approval from the federal law before changing those. So essentially the pre-clearance. So that allowed us to hold certain states accountable for their historically oppressive practices. But unfortunately, in 2013, Shelby County versus Holder actually challenged the constitutionality of Section 4 and 5 and essentially said that Section 4 was unconstitutional, therefore saying that Section 5 was going to be unconstitutional because it was no longer necessary or relevant to the political status and sphere of our world right now. So they no longer exist, and you actually see a lot of states take action right after that ruling. So an example is Texas, who has already made it a requirement, I believe, to require IDs to be present at certain polling stations. I don't know all of the details regarding that piece of legislation, but I do know that that was something that is heavily impacting language minorities in Texas and ensuring that they don't show up to these polling taxes to make the correct vote. And that heavily impacts representation, at least in Texas, and those districts that are allowing that to happen. And then moving over to the California Voting Rights of 2001, primarily aimed to address voting rights issues and increase representation for minority communities. So it prohibited specifically voting practices that diluted the voting power of protected classes, and that includes both racial and language minorities. And then, of course, the main part and chunk of it is it allowed for legal challenges against at-large election systems that result in voter dilution. So again, holding those cities and districts who haven't made the switch from at-large to district elections, it allowed organizations in other cities to take action against them and essentially sue them for not making the change. And then just to go through a little bit of the policy shifts and why federalism became so important to us and why we chose to use it as our theory. As we all know, pre-Civil War, there was a high disenfranchisement of non-white minorities, specifically slavery still existed during this time. And so we moved to post-Civil War with the implementation of the 13th and 14th Amendments, which abolished slavery and afforded over 50,000 African Americans the right to vote. And we saw for the first time that 300 African Americans were elected. But of course, when the federal government chose to take power back by implementing these 13th and 14th Amendments, you see a lot of backlash from states who didn't agree with the abolishment of slavery. So we move on to the Klan stage, where you see Black voters being deterred from polling stations because of increased violence and intimidation brought upon by groups by the KKK or Proud Boys. So like I said, you see the states trying to take their power back. They lost a little bit of grip of it and they wanted it back. So they started deterring voters. But then the federal state chose to reinforce the 14th Amendment and revise it to prevent any fear and intimidation tactics. But then again, you see the states try to get power back again during the Reconstruction era through the dilution and disenfranchisement of Black voters. So you see racial gerrymandering, at-large elections, poll taxes, literacy tests, literally anything that they could impose that wasn't so visibly racist in their thinking. So they try to do that to deter any sort of non-white voters from showing up to the polling taxes. But then you finally see the federal state come back and implement the VERA of the 1965 to overcome discriminatory voter suppression. And again, we see the states take back power, but in a different way. You see California finally implement the CVRA of 2001 to compensate for the deficiencies that the 1965 Act had. And so it's the irony of how historically we see these states taking back power to limit voting right protections, but California actually becomes the first state to take power back in a different way to expand minority voting rights to them. So the timeline of transitions to by-district elections in California, you see prior to the passage in 2001, you only see 28 cities actually employing this district election process, and San Diego was actually one of those. And then you see CVRA pass in 2001. We move to 2018, and you only see about, we only have about 82 cities actually hold district-based elections. So we're moving about 17 years forward in time, and we only have 82 cities making that transition. And primarily, most of the cities were in Southern California. So you see an issue of enforcement and implementation. A lot of the cities and districts were not taking up the CVRA as they should have, and the state wasn't holding them accountable. And even moving to last year, 2022, only 90 cities currently in transition, 32 community college districts, and 165 school districts have made the transition. And to put that into perspective, that's about 33% of all the districts in California that have made the transition. So even 2 decades after the passage of the CVRA, we're not seeing much changes in cities holding themselves accountable to making the switch from at-large to district-based. And we'll see in the next slide what kind of difference it actually makes in representation when we make those switches. But cities are continuing to be held through litigation and suing processes to get that switch over. So like I said, we focused primarily on these two case studies, Anaheim, which made the switch in 2012, and Whittier that made the switch in 2013. Anaheim is represented by the blue line and Whittier is represented by the orange line. And I want to specifically focus on the yellow line, which is the year of their first district elections. The red line represents the year that they made the switch over to, but the yellow one is primarily what we want to look at. As you can tell, Anaheim had a number of few Latinx council members be elected in the years prior to their first district elections. But you do see a substantial increase that's a little bit more sustained after their first year of district elections. But Whittier is actually the one that we were surprised by the most, because you see not up until 2017, Whittier didn't have a single Latinx council member elected in their city. It wasn't until after their first year of district elections do you actually see at least 2 get elected in 2019, and it has remained pretty sustained over the years. So an example of just like that, how impactful that switch can be for these cities and for these communities who have never had representation. And I know this is a lot of information, but this is just kind of an overview of important and significant CVR cases that we found during our research. Notably, obviously, the first one, Sanchez versus the city of Modesto, was one of the first cases in lawsuits brought upon California. So the city of Modesto had not made the switch over to district-based elections. And so there was a lawsuit filed against them, and Sanchez was the plaintiff who actually won, and they were sued for $3 million, or the city of Modesto was sued for $3 million in fees. Similarly, Santa Clara was also sued for $3 million. And a number of other cities have gotten large litigation fees that they have to pay. Pico Neighborhood Association versus the city of Santa Monica is another notable one, because it is the first one where the plaintiffs actually didn't win, and the city of Santa Monica won in this case. So even after 20 years of existence of the CVRA, the Supreme Court and the California Supreme Court ruled that they didn't violate the CVRA. So city of Santa Monica still uses at-large voting district elections, which is notable, because in their case, they weren't violating any specific rulings in the CVR case. Oh, we skipped a slide. So for our conclusions and future research, obviously we hope to observe and analyze the representational gains across all cities and districts, gather registration and turnout data for cities and districts across California, and then compare those representational gains across the cities and districts to those who have not transitioned from at-large elections to district elections, and analyze current voter suppression efforts. So originally this research, we were going to get that registration and turnout data so that we can specifically analyze how voters are functioning. But there were some issues with the state secretary in getting that information. So we had to make a switch quickly over to our research. But yes, in the future, we hope to continue this and be able to look at how our voters are acting so that we can add to this research. But these are my references. And then, of course, would like to thank everybody who helped me with this research. But thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. Questions or thoughts about the presentation? Excellent job, very provocative. So let me ask you, back to the federalism question. It seems like there are these, when you were looking specifically at the Federal Voting Rights Act, there's progress and then some backstepping and some more progress, all kind of contingent on power of interpretation, right? The way that the courts would interpret the language. When we get to the California Voting Rights Act, I guess I have two questions. One, do you have a sense of it being crafted to withstand these challenges that might be based on a certain kind of, like if you look at why Santa Monica won, was it the power of argument? And then, so how do you write these kinds of laws or craft them so that they can't be misinterpreted, or so that the plain language will be, you know, something that carries the day? Because if you look at the Supreme Court case that you mentioned, you know, 5-4 ruling, which a lot of people say gutted the Federal Voting Rights Act and made the California Rights Act more necessary. It comes down to what people can do with the language and the law, right? So what did you find about the way that the laws were written or crafted to withstand those kinds of challenges?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I do want to note that the Pico Association neighborhood versus Santa Monica was a special case, and they ultimately ended appealing the original verdict on that, because originally they did say it violated the CVRA. Then they turned to the appeal courts, and then they were like, actually, no, it doesn't. And that's because the specific language in the CVRA says that in order for a city or district to make that switch, they essentially have to their current voting system has to actually oppress and marginalize the voters in that community. And so what ended up happening in the appeal courts was that they saw that it wasn't actually polarizing or marginalizing any voters in Santa Monica. So that was their decision. That's why they based their decision off. I didn't look into specifics on Santa Monica just because those weren't the cases that we were looking at. But in the future, I do hope to look specifically more at that language. But I do know that the CVRA specifically says that if there is no proof that of polarization or voter suppression, then you can't necessarily force that switch onto them.
Great, thank you. Any other question or comment? If not, we will go to Professor Lamar Perry, who is new faculty at UC San Diego. So welcome, Professor Perry. And his presentation is titled New Play Development as a Tool of Anti-Racism, specifically through the lens of Black queerness. And please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the welcome. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Can you all see this? Okay, praise. So as stated, my name is Professor Lamar Perry. I use he, him pronouns, but truthfully, anything said respectfully. And I'm in the directing area here in the Department of Theater and Dance. I teach acting and directing theory and practice, as well as Black theater history. And professionally, I'm also a freelance director, right? I kind of want to start with like, what is the role of a director, just so we're all working with the same operational definition. A theater director or stage director, right, is a professional in the theater who oversees and orchestrates the mounting of a theater production such as a play, dance, drama, musical theater performance by unifying various artistic disciplines such as lights, sound, scenic, costumes, actors, the playwright, and other aspects of production. The best way to think of a director is as an artistic project manager right? Or the artist who visualizes and physicalizes the text of the play, right? Taking something from the page to the stage. That's the work that I do, right? My research in particular focuses on the productions that I direct and the theories and pedagogies that inform my artistic choices, just as a framework. Some quick background as to like why new play development, right, is a tool of restorative justice. So we all know, or hope that we all know, that the first chattel slaves arrive in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, right? And it's really important to note that it's Western Anglo-Saxon Christianity, which is upheld by biblical texts, which is also, right, then used to uphold, right, the subservience of chattel slaves. At the same time, it's also used to demonize Afro-Indigenous practices, right, which include the space for Black and queer, Black and brown queer, two-spirit, and trans people, right? So centering that Black and brown queer, trans, two-spirit folks, right, have always existed, right? But that over the process, right, of the colonization of this land, right, and chattel slavery, that biblical texts are used to demonize those practices, right, driving them to the fringes, right, marginalizing them, essentially. September 21st, 1821, the African Grove Theater opens with a production of Richard III, featuring James Hewlett in the titular role, and is founded by William Alexander Brown, right, an Afro-Caribbean man. And that's important to note because it's an assertion and a reminder that even as early as the 19th century, that Black folks, right, were engaging in the practice of theater. We often talk about theater through the lens that the emergence of Black work, Black playwrights, Black artists, right, primarily happens on at the onset of the Black arts movement, which is led by Amiri Baraka and Ed Bullins, right? These facts just sit to counter, right, a field and a practice that we centrally think of as being cishet and white, right, and acknowledging that even as far back as the 19th century, right, Black folks have been doing this storytelling work. March 11th, 1959, A Raisin in the Sun premieres on Broadway by Lorraine Hainsbury, a queer Black woman. It's the first play on Broadway written by a Black woman and directed by a Black man. And then we jump all the way to 2019 when Choir Boy, a queer Black play with music, right, premieres, and it's written by a queer Black playwright, Oscar winner Terrell Alvin McCraney, and debuts on Broadway, right? It really isn't until the mid-2000s that we start to see the emergence of Black queer work in the American theater, in spite of the fact that even going back as far as the 19th century, Black queer artists have been contributing to the American theater, and Black queer artists, right, have been working in the commercial space of Broadway. Really want to lift up and center that Lorraine Hainsbury, although she was married to a man at the time A Raisin in the Sun debuted on Broadway, what we now know is she truthfully was a queer Black woman, right, as revealed to us through her estate after her untimely death, and a collection of letters and poems that she wrote under a pseudonym during her lifetime. My work really centers three quotes, right? The first is that the most unprotected person in America is the Black woman, right? Civil rights activist Malcolm X said this. The next that I center is that visibility is survival. And that's said by Joseph Bean, who was a Black queer writer and activist, right, who dies on the onset of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. The last is that you don't know who you are until you've truly seen yourself reflected. And that's by my mentor, Steve H. Broadnax III. And the combination of those three things really leads to my practice as an artist, right? I come to storytelling, right? I come to directing theater from the lens of being a Black queer femme, right? From occupying marginalized space, not only in the world, but also in a field that still primarily centers cishet white men in their stories, right? i.e. Shakespeare, right? And looking at the ways in which we can center the stories of those who have traditionally not occupied positions of power in the American theater to allow people to tell and name themselves into the canon and into the zeitgeist through the ways in which we understand ourselves, right? I think the simplest way to reduce my work is to say that I make work for the little Black boy in the corner, the little queer Black boy in the corner who needs to know that the way that he lives and walks and moves through the world is okay. Right? How does this show up in terms of practice? It comes in two forms mainly, right? Which is new play development, right? And new play development is the process in which a playwright, right, goes from the inception of the idea of a story all the way through the initial debut production of a play, right? And then also reimagine classics, right? Using classical plays as a vehicle to subvert the notion that Black, queer, femme, and Indigenous folks didn't exist when the work was created, right? Which is an act of civil disobedience to acknowledge that my ancestors were there, existing, thriving, and living, right, when this work was initially created. Why is any of this important? Because when we think about theater, when we think about Broadway, which is still traditionally called the Great White Way, right? We think about the Shakespeares, we think about the Ibsens, the Anton Chekhovs, right? We think about the great white stalwarts of this art form, right? And we don't think about the Black queer folks, the Black femmes, right? The Afro-Indigenous, the Afro-Latinx, the Chicanx writers, right? Who have been contributing to the storytelling of the American theater since its inception. Right? So my work and my practice really looks at not the emergence of these folks, but the restoring of these people, right, to the center of the American theater, because they've always been doing this work. Now, as a director, that shows up in a lot of different ways. And I want to look at 2 productions on my website primarily to help illuminate or show examples of how this shows up in my work, right? You'll often see in a production helmed by me, not only, right, Black bodies, but Black bodies through a litany of the ways that we've come to understand them, right? We recognize that in entertainment specifically, Black femininity is usually limited to, right, thin, light skin, right, women who acquiesce to European beauty standards, right, either through their hair, their makeup, and a litany of other, right, cultural markers that seek to distance themselves from their Blackness. My work rejects that notion, right? And really centers not only that Black is beautiful, right, but the fullness of the Black body, right, from thin to plus size, from dark skin to light skin, right, from a litany of gender and sexual identities, right, all deserve to be seen. Because if we're actually talking about liberation work, if we're actually talking about the act of Black liberation, you don't get to pick and choose which Black people you liberate, right? You have to pick the Black people that you don't like, the elderly, right, the differently abled, the fat folks, the femmes, the queer folks, the trans folks, right? If liberation is not for everyone, then what you're not actually interested in is liberation, right? You're interested in occupying a space similar to white supremacy. The first production that I want to look at is a production of Animals Out of Paper by Rajiv Joseph. The play tells the story of Alana, right? Alana is a recent divorcee who is living in a small apartment as she's trying to figure out who she is outside of her marriage, right? She spent the better portion of the last decade in relationship to a man, even though she's an expert origamist, right, in her field. And over the course of the play, her relationship with a local high school teacher and then a student who later becomes her mentee helps her to find the strength and the courage, not only to see herself through the power of like who she is as a woman, but also for her to tap back into her artistic creativity. When the show originally debuted and premiered, the actress playing Alana was a white woman, right? This production, which I directed in 2022, marked the first time that Alana was played by a Black woman, right? Also a plus size Black woman who, as you can see, is wearing her natural hair, right? So why is that important and why is that needed in the centering of like new plays and like restorative justice? Because as we're going through the journey of this story, which centers, right, the healing of a woman and a femme, right, outside of her relationship to a man, it's important that we teach audiences that as they think about which woman deserves the space to heal, that they're also thinking about Black women, right? And not just the Black women that we're taught in the media to see as desirable, but every Black woman, every Black body, right? Breezy Lee is the actress featured in these photos, and she's just as stunning as her peers, right? But traditionally, we don't occupy and hold the same space for her to play these lead roles, right? Particularly, right, them that embrace African aesthetics. So these are just some of the production photos that show the costuming, the hair, the makeup, right? That again, really center, right, the beauty of the Black body and the litany of ways that it shows up in the world, right? And that's what we're talking about when we talk about using theater as restorative justice and using new play development and the reimagining of classics, right, as a restorative justice tool. The audience at this theater is primarily white, and this may be one of the first, if only, opportunities that they get to see a story told on a Black body, right, in which they get to imagine and empathize with a Black woman outside of the confines of the struggle of race and gender, right? Here, we're just watching the story of someone who's trying to figure out their life after a divorce, right? And who can't, one, empathize with that just based on the divorce statistics in this country, but more importantly, the images that we see on stage and in television and film directly correlate to the stereotypes, tropes, right, and understandings that we come to have with people that we may not be in community with. Right, so very important to me as an artist to center a plus size Black femme, right, who's wearing her natural hair, because that is often not a person that many people outside of Black spaces are in relationship with. And the hope, right, is not just to build empathy for that community, but also that people will then seek and engage Black femmes, right, in engagement and in community outside of the theatrical space. The next production that you're gonna see, sorry, give me 1 second. Of course, my computer wants to move slow, is Mud Row by Dominique Morisseau. And this was staged at Detroit Public Theater in the summer of 2022. Mud Row tells the story of 2 generations of Black women in a family who are seeking to heal the traumas, right, of growing up poor and Black in a lower class suburb. Specifically, the sisters in the present are dealing with the issues of addiction and how addiction can isolate one person from their family, right? And what does the reconciliation of family look like, specifically through the lens of property, right? So grandma has died, grandma has left her house to the older, more responsible sister who doesn't need the property, but it's the younger sister who is also a drug addict, who's recovering and trying to figure her life out, who needs the house to live in because she can't afford to live anyplace else. And again, what you'll see in this production are plus size bodies, dark-skinned bodies, right? African aesthetics and design choices, both in fashion, hair, and makeup, right? Again, to recenter who and what type of Black person we hold space for as we continue to one, learn more about Blackness, right? For those who are non-Black people of color, right, and white. And even within Black spaces, for us to address our colorism, our fat phobia, our femphobia, right, and a litany of other things that quite literally lead to the death and the murder of Black women in our spaces, right? The rates for Black femicide is astronomical when you look at where we are in terms of like history and progress, especially in how we think of our knowing of feminism, right? Why is any of this important? Again, because the images that we see in television and film and theater directly correlate to how folks who sit in spaces outside of these communities think about who they are, right? They think about the ways in which it is to see these kinds of women be loved, right? To see them laugh, to see their joy, to see their pain, to see their reconciliation. And suddenly they don't feel distant, right, from you or yourself, right? Suddenly the struggles of 2 generations of women feel like you and your mother, or you and your aunt, or your cousins, right? And it develops an empathy for people, right, whose storytelling directly correlates to the violence that they experience in the world, right? So the centering of Black queers, Black femmes, right, and theatrical productions, for me, is an act of restorative justice, not just in terms of making sure that our stories are told in the present and then also used as historical markers in the future, right, but are quite literally an act, right, of intervention to hope to dismantle the systems that propagate violence against these communities. And that's the end of my research.
Thank you so much. I want to acknowledge, first of all, what a great presentation, and note that we're just a little over time. So are there 1 or 2 questions for Professor Perry? You all know I have a couple, but I would really like to give other people a chance. All right, so I'm going to jump in. I have two questions, but I'll try to make them really brief. So, when you're talking about this great movement to center a kind of blackness that's been, as the word you used earlier, I think was alienated. I was thinking about in that period, like in the before times, maybe before Raisin in the Sun, there was a kind of coded way of getting those Black queer messages, presences out, and I was wondering what you saw, because I know a little bit about how some of that coded stuff got out, but what did you see in that space?
Sure. I mean, I actually use A Raisin in the Sun as the example, right? Because the play is written by a Black queer woman, and there's a very clear queer-coded character in the cast. So Benita, the youngest daughter of the main protagonist, right, is fighting to go to college, right, in the early 1950s, 1960s, right, which for women at the time was still like a revolutionary act. She's also being courted by men who want to marry her, two men in particular, Joseph Assagai and George Murchison, right, who are pursuing her romantically, and she rejects them, right? There's also a very prolific moment in the play where Benita cuts off all her hair and really embraces African aesthetics in a time when Black women are told to perm their hair to conform to European beauty standards, right? To uphold Western femininity as a tool of being able to pass for respectability politics. Benita is a very queer-coded character, right? Her rejection of male attention, her centering of self in the pursuit of her education, right, very much speaks to, right, the queer politics that we know Lorraine actually held within herself, right, in the later years of her life. But not being in a space to write a commercially successful queer character, it's often theorized that Benita is queer-coded in that way. And that's often how queerness was presented, right? It was presented through social markers that queer folks could often recognize, right, but would not betray us, right, to the mainstream, so that we could still try to occupy commercial spaces or just have access to resources. I think what we're seeing now is a contention that queer identity is, no longer anything that is subversive, that it deserves to be in the mainstream, right? And also